and welcome to the SKaffeehaus, the podcast brought to you by the Baroque collective Solomon's Knot, where we explore behind the scenes, or behind the arras, if you will, talking to interesting people and exploring the themes around our projects. If you enjoy the podcast, spread the word and head to our website at solomonsnot.co.uk, where you can find all of our upcoming performances and sign up for our newsletter so you never miss a gig. I'm SK Artistic Director Jonathan Sells, and in this episode I'm chatting to academic Bettina Varwig, stage director John La Bouchardière, and SK keyboard player Chad Kelly about J.S. Bach's St. Matthew Passion. What is it, and how will Solomon's Knot approach it? So welcome to our cafe house. I hope you've got your coffees ready. I know Bettina has already received her SKaffeehaus trademark coffee cup for being such a long-standing contributor to this little coffee room. Today we are talking about Bach's St. Matthew Passion, which we are performing at Easter, 3 times around Easter, and in the Herderkirche in Weimar, in Snape Maltings out in Suffolk on Easter Sunday, controversial, and in Trinity College Chapel shortly thereafter in Cambridge, and then we're coming back to it 3 times in June in the Nikolaikirche in Leipzig, and for Stour Music and for the Wigmore Hall, although it's a little bit too big for the Wigmore Hall, so we are popping down the road to St. James's Spanish Place for our performance of it. And I want to say a very big welcome to our 3 guests today and introduce them for you. So SKaffeehaus Stammkundin Bettina Varwig is Professor in Music History at the University of Cambridge. Her research focuses on music and cultural history in the early modern period, in particular in the German-speaking lands, and she's interested in questions of musical meaning and expression, historical modes of listening, and music's place in the history of the body, the emotions, and the senses, which is all excellent background for this particular discussion. And she's also worked on issues of reception and historiography, in particular the reception of J.S. Bach's music in the 20th and 21st centuries. She's written a book on the histories of Heinrich Schütz and has edited Rethinking Bach, published by Oxford University Press last year, which rethinks a number of fundamental narratives and assumptions around Bach and his music. Welcome, Bettina. Hi. Welcome back, I should say. John La Bouchardière is here. He is a stage director, and he worked with us on the John Passion that we did at the Leipzig Bach Fest in 2019, a torrid day that none of us shall ever forget. That whole performance is actually still available to view online on the Bach at Home platform. He has a history of dramatizing non-dramatic material, including the full Monteverdi with E. Fagiolini, which was a show which I first witnessed about 20 years ago and completely blew my mind. That's probably could be the subject of a whole nother podcast episode, what they did with that book of Monteverdi's madrigals, memorized and dispersed throughout the space. Also a fantastic DVD available to anyone who still owns a DVD player. He's also dramatized John Adams' El Nino and Joby Talbot's Path of Miracles for Spoleto Festival in America. Once upon a time, he was a staff director at ENO, where he assisted Deborah Warner on the St. John Passion. And most importantly, in the context of this discussion, he's working with us to dramatize the Matthew Passion in our upcoming performances, and in those 5 churches and 1 concert hall, which I mentioned earlier. And last but not least, Chad Kelly is a musical director, pianist, harpsichord, organist, arranger and composer, and long-standing SK Continuo keyboard player. When he's not playing Continuo or as a soloist, he's working in the Opera House. Currently on the staff of Opera Australia, I was interested to learn. I knew that Chad had been living in Australia for a while, but now he's also working there, which is excellent news, and previously at the Bayerische Staatsoper and English National Opera. He also tells me he has yet to be wholly convinced, or at least blown away by the St. Matthew Passion, so I hope he will add a healthy, critical voice to our discussion today. It's great to have all 3 of you here. So, Bettina, Perhaps you could just kick us off. I mean, we have to assume for our listeners some kind of working knowledge of the Matthew Passion for this discussion. Otherwise, we would be here for a very long time explaining really what it's all about. But could you give us an impression of what the Matthew Passion is?
Well, what is the Matthew Passion? It is one of the most celebrated pieces in the canon of Western classical masterworks that wasn't conceived as that at all, right? So the way that most people tend to encounter it now is in going to a concert hall and hearing it as a piece of great autonomous Western art. The way it was conceived was, of course, for liturgical service on Good Friday, telling the biblical narrative of Jesus's crucifixion in musicalized terms. So that's a tradition that started in the Lutheran Church right from the word go of the Reformation, really. By the time we get to the 1720s, when Bach wrote the Matthew Passion, this had grown into a kind of musical spectacle of quite inappropriate proportions, really, in the sense that, you know, if you perform the piece as part of the service, that service will last easily over 3 hours, and the musical portion will take up the majority of that. So it comes in two parts, and a sermon would have been preached in the middle of it, and basically Bach draws out all the stops and goes to really stunning lengths to bring this story to life and use it as a kind of catalyst for spiritual, bodily, mental transformation of his congregants. I don't know. Is that a...
Yeah, no, that's a great start. It's one of those classic works that we put on a pedestal, isn't it? It's so difficult not to introduce it as Bach's monumental Matthew Passion. I mean, one undeniable thing about it is that it is long, as you say. That it's monumental in length, but it sort of takes on its own religious significance almost in amongst concert goers. For various reasons, it's attained some kind of status. Chad, you want to say something about that?
No, I was just wondering, Bettina mentioned that, of course, it was originally intended, supposedly for Bach's congregants, but I don't know whether, because, of course, there's so much time separating us and there's so much distance and so much abstract thought in between then, was it, in fact, for Bach's congregants? Was it for Bach himself? Was it for Bach's bosses? Was it for future musicians beyond Bach's time? You know, as in, I sort of, I just wonder whether Bach was writing for his audience, in other words, the congregants, or who his audience was, whether it was the congregants or whether it was for himself, or whether it was for this sort of relationship between him and God, you know, where he would write these sort of dedicatory pieces, you know, just that sort of thing. I just wonder whether it was actually for his congregants, or in fact for his time, or whether he was just doing it for himself.
Well, I think if you ask the great man, I'm just going to step in those shoes and provide the answer.
I speak to him. I speak to him daily. I call him on Zoom. Usually, when everyone else is asleep in Europe, I call him. Bettina, I promise.
Well, you ask him then.
Well, I have, but I'm now asking you.
No, I think what Bach would say is that he writes his music for the praise of God, right? Fundamentally, the function of music in the service, but also in the world in general, was to honor and enhance the glory of God in his creation, right? And then...
That's what he says. That's what he writes.
No, I think, I mean, from all the evidence we have, I think we need to go with that. But what I don't think that means is that what Bach's interested in is that sort of image of him as preaching a sermon in music, right? So this idea that somehow what this music is doing is it's representing in tones the kind of theological messages that the accompanying sermon would have tried to get across, right? So this idea of Bach as the fifth evangelist, this idea that really what we should be listening for is, what does it all mean? What's the theological message? What's the deep? How do we need to decode this? Right? I don't think Bach was primarily a theologian. He was a musician who was interested in squeezing everything he could out of his materials, and he was interested in music as music and the possibilities inherent in what you could do with music, both as a sort of intricate structural thing, because he's obviously obsessed with just how can these notes fit together in 100 million more ways. But also, I think, in terms of music as this kind of, as I said, this kind of catalyst for something cathartic, for something transformative. So using music as a way to really immerse people in a feeling of horror at their own sinfulness and instilling a kind of deep sense of remorse and penitence within their own bodies and souls and skin and bones, and then allowing music to act as a kind of release valve, as a way of then getting the tears flowing and opening the heart and softening the heart and driving out the sinful matter, and then you're ready to receive grace and be saved.
So that opening call in the first chorus, "Helft mir klagen," you're saying that's what the Matthew Passion is effectively doing. That's its role. It's helping all of these people to grieve, not only for the death of Christ, most obviously, but in a way also for their own sin, for their own part in it's a counseling or some kind of therapy, as grieving is, of course, for dealing with all of these negative feelings, horrible emotions, and guilt, and all the rest of it that is brought up by this story.
Are you saying that the congregants hearing it for the first time, the very first time it was ever performed, would have recognised that immediately hearing the beginning of a chorale melody? As in, I find it, as Bach clearly was writing these sort of musical codes, of which there are clearly many, these references to this and to that. They clearly weren't going to be, most of them weren't going to be recognizable to the congregation or to many generations potentially after him. It was only since, the past 250 years of going through it and with a fine tooth comb that we find new things. Potentially we find things that shouldn't have been found,
I don't know, Chad. I just, I think there's quite a lot of it which is not really that coded. So much of it is so direct. What you're saying, Bettina, about him not taking a theological angle on the whole thing. It's not cerebral or preachy. A lot of it is really just plugging it straight into the listener. I think there's so much in the piece. Of course, the text is almost a larger part of it than the music. The chorale themes is one thing because they trigger an emotional response, and I'd love to get more deeply into all of these layers. But it seems that the text and the way that the music takes the text on as a vehicle plugs these emotions that are brought up, and the guilt and the sin and all the rest of it, plugs that so deeply into the listener's heart and mind. It does really almost physicalize it, as you say, Bettina. I don't think there's that much decoding to be done, to be honest.
Well, no. So hearts and minds, yes, of us today, and in fact, this is what's very important for, say, John to add an extra layer potentially, and for Solomon's not to add an extra layer of, in fact. But I find it very hard to fathom. Yes, of course, the allusions that, yes, of course, people have recognised text and they will have recognized specific chorale melodies, and they will have recognized the regular pageantry of the Good Friday service and the Passion hearing. They will have recognized that. But nonetheless, the very intricate details which we now pore over and we now celebrate and we rightly recognize, they would not have been recognized at the time. And it's only since having pored over it so much and so much. And I'm just wondering whether those tiny details, which we all love, which we all think are so wonderful and such genius, whether actually
What
they're.
kind of tiny details are you specifically talking about?
I mean, it
What
could.
kind of thing do you mean?
Okay, so could it be the filigree flute lines above all the chorus, the tuba chorus lines, where, of course, the flutes would never have been heard? And what role are these flutes playing when they're playing a completely different role melodically to everything else that the entire full orchestra and choruses are playing? What sort of are they? Those sort of what is that? That's for no one else other than for Bach. Maybe his flute players, maybe the people stood next to the flute players.
Etliche aber schlugen ihn ins Angesicht und sprachen:
Yeah, that's details like that. I think you probably could say may not have been picked up on a interpretative level.
No, but they're the sorts of things that we rightly now think, oh my good word, this is the most incredible thing. That how amazing that this missing detail. But of course, maybe that's to miss the bigger picture. And that's what I'm missing myself, and what I'm looking forward to hopefully enjoying when we.
We'll put the flutes next to you, then that'll be fine.
Please.
On the stage. What I think it's worth breaking down the way that these different layers, different voices within the Passion structure are put together, because this is one of the most fascinating things about this type of Passion, specific type of Passion, which Bach works with most famously in the John and the Matthew Passions, where, unlike the Passion Oratorio, the whole Bible text has not been transformed into a new play, as it were. This isn't all new poetry, as you get in the Brockus Passion of Handel, for example, and it incorporates the word for word, or very, very almost word for word biblical story, Matthew's Gospel, 2 chapters, and surrounds that with certain kinds of framing devices. So Pitzander, Bach's librettist, presumably worked with him to put this whole text together. I think the opinion is that Bach probably selected the chorale verses. Pitzander wrote these new poetic texts to respond immediately to what's happening in the Bible story. And then you have these Daughter of Zion movements which recur throughout the piece, which stand at a different kind of distance from what's going on. But as a listener, let's take the case of the contemporary listener in Bach's congregation. You have all sorts of different historical distance, going, of course, all the way back to the original events and then the retelling of those events by Matthew later, and zooming up all the way to the present day, brand new poetry, brand new words which have never been heard before, which have been written specifically for this world premiere, written very much in the modern aesthetic of the day, designed to reach out and grab that listener and cut through all of that historical distance and make people realize this isn't about something that happened 1700 years ago and is very dusty and old. This is something which you are implicated in, which you are watching now. We're trying to we are reliving, we're retelling this story because it's extremely relevant to whether or not your soul will go to heaven or to hell. So a pressing and extremely important matter for all those people. And the interesting thing that I also want to focus on today is, because that piece was so specifically aimed at those people then, and was designed to be most relevant to them. Oh yeah, we can argue about that. Chad. How does the distance between that time and now change how we listen to it? One little thing, I see Chad shaking his head. I agree on some level, Chad, when about who was Bach writing this for. One thing perhaps we can talk about later is also this autograph score, which he took incredible care over, and he even got his red pen out for it. And he was obviously there creating some kind of object for posterity. There was obviously an element of that in the way that he preserved the physical materials of this piece. But for me, it was obviously conceived as something to be as relevant as possible and immediate as possible for those people who are listening to it for the first time. John?
Well, I kind of agree with Chad in a way. I didn't think I would on this particular point, but I do think that it to some extent, I'm not sure it matters. Bach was writing for his own time, and maybe it was for himself or for his own audience, his congregation, but within the framework of contemporary life in Leipzig then. And that was his understanding of the world, and that was their understanding of the world. So maybe it doesn't matter too much whether it was for him or for them. Obviously, if there are details that we don't hear, and the things we see that are in the score that we don't actually know about experiencing it, and that's kind of fascinating in its own way. In terms of the layers, I do think it's perhaps the most fascinating thing about the piece dramaturgically is that you step in and out of something. You step in and out of the drama, and that Bach presents the gospel in very modest terms. It's almost like it is text, as if it's fact. And if although of course the continuo and the way the evangelist and Jesus in particular express those words is moving and touching in and expressive, that he uses very, very modest forces compared to everything he dedicates to what we're meant to think and feel around that story. So the subject, it seems to me, is not really Jesus' suffering whatsoever. It's about our relationship with that suffering, and that's where he throws all his weapons. How we feel about it today, I think, it's almost not my place to say, really. My own faith is pretty wobbly. I believe in God more when I listen to Bird and Bach, and if I don't listen to Bird and Bach, I don't believe in it very much. Certainly isn't very much part of my daily life, and yet, we're working on a project like this. I have to commit to the piece. I commit to the text and what I think Bach was getting at, and what I think the gospel is meant to mean. I mean, it's a slightly educated guess, and then we commit to expressing that as best we can in our own terms, and whatever it means to us will be meaningful in some way. And whether we whether we're trying to convert people to Christianity is not necessarily the point. By engaging with the piece ourselves in a very authentic manner is inherently meaningful, and that must communicate on some level.
I'd like to ask Bettina, if this piece was so specifically aimed with such a strong message at those original listeners, and Bach's music, as you said, aimed to grab them by the heart or whatever it was, how does that change for us now? Assuming we're not Lutherans, assuming we're not fearing for our mortal souls as a result of our implicated guilt in the death of Christ, why do people still flock to hear the Matthew Passion?
Well, I think there's different answers you could give that. I mean, I'm a non-believer. I haven't found God through Bach. I don't think it has to be that. If we're looking at this music as a way to allow us to live through and immerse ourselves and feel things that define the boundaries of what it means to be human, let's say, the very, very lows and the very, very highs, then that is not something that's necessarily tied to a particular faith or any faith at all. And so something like that opening chorus you mentioned, Johnny, I don't think that we necessarily need to hear it or use it as a way to internalize the particular Christian relationship with this particular story of Jesus and so on. We also, I don't think, I don't know, Chad, I get a real sort of sense of suspicion of the musicological, grip on Bach, and that's I'm very much in tune with that, because I want to talk about this music differently. I want to talk about it not in terms of, oh, if we count these numbers of notes, then that's amazing, and it but I think if we talk about it as something that is put together in a way that necessarily overwhelms our cognitive faculties in terms of trying to keep track of all the stuff that's going on. He builds up these layers of, you've got that throbbing pedal bass that hits you right in the stomach and vibrates there and sits there, right? And then he builds up the contrapuntal layers, and you can't actually work out what's going on. It's not an exercise in trying to understand how amazing his contrapuntal abilities were or anything. But
of course, his congregations would have heard that every single week, day in, day out, when he was improvising, and he would have begun with a big pedal bass, and he would have done, it's just like the opening of the John Passion, it's just the opening of Matthew Passion. I'd say, I'm willing to say 60% of Bach's works begin with a pedal bass with a particular harmonic progression over the top before, it's, I wouldn't say that that's anything necessarily new.
No, I'm not saying it's new at all. Yeah. No, you're right. It's one of the ways in which Bach draws you into a musical universe that affects you emotionally in ways that you might not even be able to put words to, and it's that thing that music can do that I think we still find powerful today. So it gives you, I don't know, Erbarme dich, yeah, that amazing aria. Of the recognition of, oh my God, I've really screwed up. Yeah, you can't actually put a label to what this aria actually expresses. Is it there's remorse, there's a kind of a pleading, there's a sense of loss and despair, and there's also some kind of hopefulness for some kind of something out there that might actually redeem us, and so on and so on. But it doesn't really matter if you can't put any exact words to it. It's the fact that this music allows you to enter into a particular kind of affective state that you wouldn't necessarily otherwise find yourself in, and so it allows you to live through the kinds of things that might the kinds of things that are meaningful and make us human beyond the particular narrative that's going on.
I think that's really fascinating, particularly from a performer's point of view, because an audience member is going to get what they get and understand what they understand and reference it within their own understanding. But a singer, other musicians too, but I think singers, and particularly in Solomon's Knot's case, because Solomon's Knot's singers work without scores, and it's very, if you've got a score in your hand, you can sing the notes and the words in a generically meaningful way, maybe in a very specifically meaningful way, but the moment you take the score away, it's very hard not to commit to something more specific than what you're talking about. You have to commit to something, in the same way as you were playing Scarpia or Semele. You have to commit to something on stage as a character. And even though Solomon's Knot is on a concert platform, without their scores, they cannot hide. And it's one of the reasons why I was interested to work with Solomon's Knot, was to see what we do with this gap, this empty space which is left by the lack of a score. And I think it's fascinating that what you're saying, because I completely agree that an audience will have this layered sense of meaning and beauty out of what Bach has constructed. But as a performer, you kind of need, as a singer, you need to commit to something more specific than that. And in terms of what we need to do, I think that's very interesting, because it's quite a challenge, because each of the singers will have to pin down something in order to commit to that. It doesn't have to be what you or I think it is about, or what we think Matthew actually meant or Bach meant, but it has to be something specific, and it cannot be generic. In the same way as we think the difference between like a leader singer in a recital is operating in this world where the poetry is kind of his or hers, and no longer belongs to the poet because he's not reading a score anymore.
So what are you going to do? I'm really excited to hear what you're actually going to do, because I love your work, John, that I've seen. I've really enjoyed. I don't know, that Jankan thing was brilliant. So yeah,
it might not be like that.
It might not be like that.
I think it's worth.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that's worth saying is that we're trying to blur a lot of boundaries or break a lot of boundaries, or try to subvert the concert format in subtle ways and sometimes less subtle ways. One thing we are doing in this context, where possible, is to Chad will be playing a monumental organ prelude before we start,
with a pedal,
with a lot of pedals.
And yes, it does in fact start with a similar pedal with the same harmonic progression.
Exactly,
Nice.
in a controversial transposition. And we'll finish after the piece, as we did with the John Passion, with the Jakob Gallus motet, which followed every Passion performance in Leipzig. So we are alluding to a liturgical frame, let's say, and we also often in our performance we want to make it seem that the performance almost arises out of the situation naturally, or as if the performance almost erupts out of the audience. So where possible, where we're not up on a very high stage and very much separated from the audience, we try to sometimes dress similarly to them, or come out of the audience before we start, so that where the performance begins and ends is unclear, and it's not clap, 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 turn the lights down, this is a concert. So yeah, that boundary is blurred in a way, and then we have this frame which also perhaps tells you you're not quite in a concert, or it's a sort of semi-ritualized experience. And then, as John said, we don't have scores, and a lot of the instrumentalists on this occasion will also be the instrumental soloists will also be without the music, so they'll be freer to move around. And I'm very interested to hear what John thinks about this. But for me, when we're also all standing in front of the orchestra, it becomes much more of a conversation, perhaps rather one-sided conversation, but we are standing directly in front of all these listening people who feel that they have nowhere to hide, really, because we're not hiding behind our scores. They really feel that they're being addressed directly and drawn into that conversation. And I think, in a way, you don't need trapeze artists, and you don't need to be naked to, for that to be a very intense experience in and of itself. And for me, it's about tweaking that to making it as strong as possible, and challenging ourselves as performers to be as brave as possible, to accept this nakedness which we've chosen, and to just look people in the eye, really, metaphorically and literally.
Yeah, I think that's what Solomon's Knot does, and I think my job in this is not to. We're not trying to stage Matthew Passion. We're not going to use trapeze artists, but or indeed, I'm not really interested in anybody walking, we're not going to block it and to say, well, you go over there for that bit and you do that, but for that, I don't think. I have no intention of giving visual expression to the piece. I think particularly with something as complicated and layered as Matthew Passion, there's a lot of work to do to understand how to think it, and the singers are, in a sense, naked, and they need to think their way from one thing to the next in order to provide their own dramaturgical path from the beginning to the end, and it needs to make sense on some level for them. And I think my job is really just to facilitate that. We're not taking the next step and then saying what you do with that and stage it, but all of the background work and the thinking that needs to go behind a performance will still be there as if we were staging it, I think. And so we're not going to end up with a version of La Chasse with people sitting with PlayStations, or I don't think anything that feels staged. I think it would just allow Bach's work to emerge more intimately, because everybody engaged on stage, and hopefully people off stage or in the audience, will be more connected with the material than they would have been if we were sitting with scores.
Yeah, and we've discussed, John, about leaving the imaginative space as open as possible as well. I think if you stage something, obviously in a theatre most specifically, with props and costumes and so on, you're taking so many specific decisions. You're nailing a lot of things down. And that does push people in the direction, I suppose, of following your thought and following your idea, but also quite soon into a question of, do I like this or not? Do I get this production? Do I appreciate that interpretative idea, or do I not agree with it? And for me, it's much more interesting just to try to deliver what we have to deliver as directly as possible, and the rest of the imaginative space is left open inside the mind of the listener.
And I really like that, because that's one of the things that has obviously been leveled against past staging of the piece in so many ways. This question of what does this do to the work, right? And how does it violate the sort of the sacred integrity and autonomy of this work? But
it becomes reductive ultimately. If you put too many boundaries on what the piece can mean, then it can't mean other things, and that and a piece like Matthew Passion is inevitably reduced by saying that it's only about this group of people, and in the way we watch an opera, expecting us somehow to empathise with those people and not with ourselves. And Bach's piece is, I think I read in your article that in a sense the piece is putting us in it as well. That it's an opera. If it's an opera in any sense, it's an opera about the people watching the piece. It's a bit about us and our contemporary society. And so if you make it only about another group of people, then it's harder for us to engage with it. And there's one thing doing that with material that's hard for us to access. There are pieces that audiences find difficult to get their head around. And although Matthew Passion is incredibly complicated and hard to comprehend, it's extremely accessible in terms of emotional engagement. So you don't need to force it into something that makes sense so that people can understand it. It doesn't need that. It's incredibly expressive, and as you said, it punches you in the stomach. So I don't think the piece demands that sort of treatment.
No, and then this idea of breaking down those boundaries is so important, because the way in which it is presented on the concert hall stage is such a weird choreography in itself that has become so naturalized that we assume that this is just it's unmediated, right? We just get the work as it is, but actually it's such a weird ritual, right? And it does create all these boundaries around how you're meant to behave, how you're meant to engage with the piece, and it puts the audience in a particular place, right? And that's and the answer obviously is not to go back to saying, but so we must perform it how it was in the liturgy and so on, because that doesn't create the kind of meaningfulness for an audience today. But somehow allowing that kind of so not historical authenticity, but a kind of personal authenticity of Absolutely. That expressive intensity that then can do that job of actually drawing people in the way that, in some form, the piece is designed to do.
I have always been fascinated, since I think I was about 6, with the possibility that every audience member has of actually breaking the rules and walking on stage. I've always been, every time I sit in the auditorium, I just think, but I could. And although I don't really want the audience to do it, I really want them to feel like they could, and that there's nothing actually stopping them from doing so, and that the barrier between us is so fluid. I remember the first time I went to the Globe, and it was transformative, because I didn't have those barriers. They were just there, and there was no frame, there was nothing to say we're here or there, and I'm not knocking those other forms of performance at all. They're valid and wonderful in the right situation. But the fluidity, I think, is incredibly important in any performance situation. And I think I'm going to refer to your some comments about the John Passion now, I think, because I know that the Lamb was very controversial. This is in Deborah Waters'
Matthew, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, the John Passion at E&O. Deborah wanted to bring a live lamb on stage, and the critics did not like it.
Dead lamb, surely would be.
No, it was alive. It was still ready for. It was a lamb for the slaughter, and Mark Padmore brought it on, and occasionally it bleated, not always. It always peed. Which was probably more of a problem for people on stage, but the audience did not know what to do. And I found it extremely powerful. The chorus actually, very interesting, found it overwhelming, not because it was funny, but just the liveness was just too much for them, and for many rehearsals they just broke down and couldn't really sing. And I think that it shook us from the comfort of our seats in the Colosseum, in the same way that asking the audience, giving them the option to sing the chorales, historically incorrect as that might have been, left us in this fluid situation where we didn't know what to do. And yes, it was alienating and Brechtian on some level, but rather that than just sit there and just soak, because then we were participating on some level.
Completely. No, I completely agree, and I think it was incredibly brave and brilliant in lots of ways. And yeah, so I had the complete opposite experience I think it was 5, maybe, and I went to my first classical concert with my parents, and it was a little church in the mountains in Austria, and it was this pianist playing Schubert, and so it was tiny, and there were chairs sort of right around where the piano was set up, and we had got like the front row seats right behind the pianist, and so there I was 5 years old, and the pianist walks on stage, sits down to play. Before he starts, he turned around, looked me in the eye, and said, "Not a peep."
Wow.
And so that was my, I don't know. And then it's taken me a long, long, long time to understand that actually it's okay to be at a concert with your body and with your presence and with, be engaged and be there. And it really, I think, what's that?
It's okay to peep.
It's
but
okay
not
to
pee.
If you're a lamb, you can do both. As a person, I think it really created a sort of framework for me for what a classical concert was. That took me a long, long time to sort of shake myself free from. So
that's a barrier. Yeah, that's a big barrier. Although bold, I think bold front row seats with your 5-year-old's a bold move.
That's my parents, yeah.
Just to say that the article to which John is referring is Bettina's article, "Beware the Lamb Staging Bach's Passions in 20th Century Music," 2014, in case anyone wants to look that up. One of the things that I think is so interesting, or at least completely different for us performing this piece now, compared to the situation we've been talking about when it was a world premiere, is that it's become a completely different thing. This whole idea of the canon, and it's one of those most pedestalized works. People come knowing this piece backwards. People come having heard this piece hundreds of times, and of course we come to it as performers, having an even more intimate relationship with it, most of us. And doesn't that turn it into something completely different? It's the repetition of a ritual. I'm sure there are many people who want to hear the Matthew Passion every year on Good Friday. They want to go, as people do also with Messiahism. It's part of their annual ritual, whether they're religious or not. I mean, my father did that for a long time, and he has I think, fairly ambiguous relationship with religion. And so, culturally, that changes the position of the piece entirely. It used to be the case that people would listen to the piece in a language that they understood, but a lot of the time, I mean, outside of German-speaking countries, of course, a lot of the time that isn't even necessary anymore. And although we may well be pretty familiar with the text and what it means, a lot of the time we're happy to just sit and listen to the sounds of it and the approximate idea of what's going on. But then, that makes it even further away from these graphic images and graphic words which Pizzanda wrote to really, push our face into the mud of that terrible story. So I'm interested, Bettina, in your thoughts of what I think we want to try and do in being as direct as possible with it is to try and cut through some of that, holy cloud, and bring the story back, make it as hard hitting as it was intended to be?
Yeah, I think defamiliarization is a really useful approach to take to something as canonical and as familiar as the Matthew Passion, where you're right. A lot of people, I think, will have their own particular relationship to the piece, probably a favorite recording, and so on and so on. And then it, I think opening up different ways of experiencing it, unexpected ways, ways that pull you in completely different directions than you thought you would, rather than sort of creating that sense of complete comfort and familiarity, where you then sit through it yet again and you've done it, and that has its own. I mean, I would grant people that that pleasure as well, but I think that there is that the way in which it can be shocking or grab you. Sort of, you get sucked in at the beginning and then you get spattered at the end, and you are completely transformed. That it would be nice not to lose that.
I'm curious, Chad, what your experiences have been, because you said this has yet to spit you out at the end, and you feel that you've had a transformative experience. Have you been involved in the piece a lot as a performer or a listener? What's your encounter been?
I've done a fair bit as a performer and slightly less as a listener. I would just jump in straight away and say that one of the things I'm most excited about over the coming months is seeing how Solomon's Knot, with John's help, realizes this piece, and I'm pinning all my hopes on that as a way of sort of. Well, no. So I must start and say that I feel closest to Bach as a keyboardist, and I think lots of keyboardists feel that way.
Which is one of the most abstract, or let's say purely musical experiences of Bach.
However weird, and yet, on the other hand, the Matthew Passion is heralded as one of his most human, one of his most personal works, which we can most. And weirdly, I don't really feel that. Whereas I feel more personally moved. I feel closer to Bach. I also feel more instinctive feelings within myself, playing something as, in inverted commas, abstract as a keyboard partita than I do from his supposedly most. And I must also preface this by saying that I am a man of the theatre. I work in opera all the time. And of course, I'd say the Matthew Passion is one of his most operatic in terms of structure and ambition and storytelling and narrative that Bach endeavored to achieve. But in that sense, on paper, I should love this piece, but just something doesn't quite click for it.
Well, you've got your work cut out for yourself.
With me,
making it click.
No, I do, and this is why I am desperate. And the cantatas, many, not all of the cantatas, many of the cantatas hit me, take me on board, transport me.
Is it the length of it? Because I mean, the Matthew Passion in a way is like lots and lots of cantatas put together, and obviously there's a sort of symmetrical superstructure. But I think some people just find the Matthew Passion too much to swallow. The John is much more compact. It's more fast moving.
Do you want me to be brutal?
I want you to be brutal. Come on, this is the space, the safe space. Bachaholics Anonymous.
Not so anonymous.
I dislike the text. I dislike the setting of the text in terms of the way it's set for the evangelist. I think the relationship between evangelist and chorus, the crowd, whoever they are, I dislike that, and I don't like the way that that's paced or structured. I don't like a lot of the voice leading in the chorales. I also don't like the I say dislike. Dislike is a strong word. It's not dislike. It's
you're not totally convinced.
As in, objectively, it's incredible. Objectively, it's perfect. But it's just I just wonder where.
Is he trying too hard? Do you think he's trying too hard?
Perhaps. I wonder whether he'd just done the John Passion and he'd revised the John Passion a few times, and maybe a few of his bosses in the church had maybe asked him to tweak some of the liturgical aspects of the John Passion, which may have been the reasons why he did that. Maybe that's why he endeavoured to set out this, whether he saw this as maybe a magnum opus, some sort of way in that. I mean, the John Passion, in the way that, say, the early Weimar cantatas literally get me in straight away. I am hooked. I am on the journey, and I am ready. And I just wonder I just wonder whether the Matthew Passion, because it's all so introverted, we just want to think about it so much. I just wonder whether that just really fits with the 21st century. I don't know. Maybe I'm speaking very. I don't know.
That's just something about what Bettina said about him pulling out all the stops that makes it too much. All those da capo arias, especially towards the end of the piece, you just sometimes, I know people who said to me, you get that da capo and you just think, oh, really?
I love a da capo. Oh, I love a da capo. And it's also the director's sort of, rarely, no, the opposite. The opposite.
You mean a stage director or a musical director?
Oh no, both. I love a da capo. I love a da capo. I think it's the best thing in music. Before.
There is something undeniably
19th century
challenging about the layers. I mean, Chad is not someone I would ever think would be challenged by something with layers because of what he does. But as an emotional experience, you do have to kind of let it wash, I think. And that if you... My own relationship with Matthew Passion is actually not that profound, in that I didn't sing it as a kid and I didn't have any performance relationship with it whatsoever. I've been to some performances of it in my life and listened to an enormous number of recordings, but I don't have any real kind of engaged. I never got my hands dirty with it before, and although that's what we have to do now, my own sense of the pieces was. The John Passion is something I knew from childhood and later, and it does hit that way. Whereas I feel like Matthew Passion is like this.
Can you explain those hand gestures to the listener?
Yes, of course. Sorry, that's not very helpful on a podcast, is it? So, John Passion is acting for radio.
Yeah. For radio.
The John Passion is direct.
Inevitable.
It comes straight between the eyes, actually. It really just, there's no avoiding it. Whereas the Matthew Passion is like a wall coming at me, I find. And yes, it is overwhelming, and maybe it's so overwhelming that you can't actually take it in. And that is our job, is to make it possible to take in. I was just going back on something you were saying, Johnny, about trying to do it for a modern audience. One of the things I find really unusual about what we're going to do is that we're opening. Our premiere will be in Weimar in front of the Cranach altarpiece. So we will have behind us literally one of the worst upstaging events of musical performance ever, where an iconic representation of Jesus' suffering, complete with a sort of demonstration of the cleansing power of his blood in one performance, and then the next performance in Aldeburgh with a brick wall. And how we span that, I think, is really interesting. I don't know the answer. I'm not going to pretend that I am, a magical.
And without an organ, without a big organ in Snape Malting, so without Chad's huge prelude.
Oh well, it doesn't matter. Well, the audience in Weimar and the audience in Snape are very different people and very different beasts.
Mm.
But should our message change? Should it adapt, or should it be?
I think it will change by the nature of the setting. Ultimately, we don't have time to rehearse it, so it's going to have to be the same. But what we mean will be different because the setting changes what it comes across as. So it's simply not going to be the same without that altarpiece behind us and without the same acoustic and sense of history being in Weimar or in Leipzig months later. It won't be the same.
A very different audience. I mean, we have
incredibly, and as you say, the German audience that probably knows the text backwards.
Do you imagine any first-time listeners in the audiences, either at Snape or Weimar?
Always.
Do you hope?
I think one has to hope.
Do you hope?
Well, this is what I was thinking. Chad, while you were speaking. It's the best gift or the biggest food almost for us as performers is knowing that there's someone there, either on stage or in the audience, who is yet to be converted. Not saying that we should thinking, I'm trying to convert you, but every time, if you're doing the Eine kleine Nachtmusik, there's always going to be someone there who's never heard it before. And one of my favorite dramatic exercises, games, which Tim Carroll used to do with us, is your goal, you have to sing this aria or sing your line. Your goal is to choose one person in the audience and make them stand up. They don't know that you're trying to make them stand up, but your focus on them and your delivery to them is so intense that you are trying to achieve some kind of physical transformation in them. And that's just a fantastic way of targeting and focusing on somebody. But that's, effectively that is what we try to do in concert. We'd love to have a standing ovation at the end of the concert. So,
that's what Solomon's Knot does. Yeah. I mean, to be honest, if there was a group that was going to convert me, it will be Solomon's Knot because of that, and especially with John's aid, enlivening their facility to bring about their communication. I'm waiting to be converted.
Yeah, it's good that you're open to being converted. At least that's a good start. I just want to come back
open heart, open mind.
Yeah,
that's all I'm saying.
Open ears. I just want to come back to one point of the story and the way that we receive this story. I do feel that there is a way we can receive this piece which has nothing to do with God. That just taking this brutal story and murder and everybody's reaction to it at face value, as Bettina said, the music humanizes the events and the words to such an extent, or manages to catch us and capture us. It seems to me that we can imagine being implicated in, as you also said, the gamut of human capabilities from the best to the worst. And this story is really not far away. I mean, it is to a large extent a political lynching, and really not far from events which surround us now, of political persecution, of groupthink, which end up in people doing horrible things to one another. And I think there's a way that this piece reaches out and hits us now because we can so easily see how close we could become to being very, very cruel to one another, and distance from the Jesus story. I think it enables us to see in our own humanity what the depths and darknesses are.
Das Intro.
And for me, that's what makes it still so emotional. That even if you couldn't care less about Jesus and what happened to him, the fact that the story is so humanized makes us see that we could still be any of us in this kind of situation, and we would also most probably fail, like Peter and Judas and all of these other people.
Is that not clear? Is that not clear at all in perhaps say Brockes's libretto?
Well,
of
no,
the Passion
because
story where he personalizes it and makes it feel like real people. You know?
But for me, Brockes goes too far. It's too vivid, it's too disgusting. We're talking about the thorns piercing through the soft temples into Jesus' brain. I mean, even some of Pizzander's imagery is quite hard to swallow for us nowadays, I feel. For me, Brockes it's just sort of so disgusting. It's a turn-off.
But I think that... sorry, go on.
I just want to say that the Matthew Passion, for example, or the John, they maintain more of a balance that doesn't go too far into that hyper realism, which for me is distancing.
But it's also about the if I remember correctly, Peter gets arias in the Brockes Passion, but in the Matthew, those arias are not his; they're ours. Those belong to us, and so it is the difference in a way between shoehorning a narrative into a space, into a time and space that says this happened here about this group of people, and so this is about Peter and his problems. But in the Matthew Passion, it's somebody who's not involved in that story who says, "Oh, I'm overwhelmed," or Geduld, like patience is. I have. In the face of injustice, I find myself really struggling with patience sometimes, and that whether I believe in God or not, that aria communicates to me more because it's not sung by a character from within the biblical story. It's about somebody sitting outside of it, relating to the story and about what it means to them, and that I find that incredibly touching.
Bettina, do you have any final thoughts for us?
Can't wait to hear it and see it.
Well, we're bringing it as close to you as we possibly can, so...
I really appreciate that. I appreciate the effort, yes.
It's hard to know how to sum up, really. Our journey with this piece continues. We haven't talked very much about the chorales and their role within all of this function, but perhaps we'll have to save that for another day. The fact that there is this seam through the piece which plugs into an old, but not that old, communal memory and sums up the associate
just
emotions
on that subject. Of course, the communal memory is important, but I think there's a really basic thing about Matthew Passion, which is: are we talking about ich or uns? And so, are we? Then we have this third person narrative, running all the way through, and all the music that Bach throws his cannons at is not in the third person. It's always in the first person, singular or plural. And I find that incredibly... it's very strong in terms of dramaturgical structure, but it seems to me that is the piece, that it's about us. And the chorales are that moment where we share something. Of course, that audience at the time would have known those chorale melodies in a way that we don't today, but I still think it has a feeling of a hymn that we feel like we could join in on, even if we don't.
The chorale becomes the universalizing, the communalizing element. Well, one could argue that the piece as a whole, the Matthew Passion, has become, for people who listen to Western classical music a lot, has become to some extent like one of those chorales in itself. It has become a piece that we know very well, that we hear over and over again. And Yes, perhaps that's one of its main functions. It brings so many of us back together in the same room, gives us a point of communal experience, and forms part of that social glue, which is a key role that culture can play.
Which goes back to Chad's points earlier at the beginning, was saying that this really for one audience of a particular time, or an audience of all time, or the future, because now the piece has entered into the repertory in a kind of has an iconic status, and it exists for us today as a great work of art around which we can gather regardless of what we think it means.
But that's why it's nice, I think, to keep thinking about how we might perform it, how we might do it, so that dialogue through the ages continues. The dialogue between Bach and this music and different audiences, and if the kind of thing that worked for 20th century audiences in terms of the concert hall performance, maybe that's on its way out, and we find different ways of continuing that dialogue.
Certainly plugging it into a place like the Herdekirche in Weimar, which is a fantastic architectural work of art in itself, with the altar piece by Cranach behind it, and the audience which we have in front of us, with whom we create on the spot this brand new musical experience. It's going to plug it in lots and lots of different directions. So we can't wait either, like Bettina. We can't wait to get stuck into the Matthew Passion, and hope that our listeners and people who come to see it with us can share their experiences with us, and we hope that Chad will continue on his journey to Damascus.
I'm ready. I'm honestly ready, open, and willing.
We're going to make Chad stand up.
Stand up,
I'm
Chad.
ready.
Stand up.
I'm ready. I'm going to be honest to myself. I need to be convinced, and I'm going to be ready.
Great.
And I'm looking forward to it.
Super. Thank you all so much for your time today. It's been great to chat, and hope to see you all soon in the flesh or otherwise. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Right.
Bye.
Lovely to see you. Take care.